kettle had been boiling for 3 minutes before I noticed. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my housecoat, the one with the fraying cuffs my daughter had been telling me to throw out for 2 years, staring at the cruise brochure I'd printed at the library. 8 pages, full colour, stapled at the corner. I'd done that part myself. The woman at the print counter had smiled at me and said, "Big trip?" And I'd said, "The biggest." That was in February. The snow was still heavy on the cedars outside, and I had just turned 67. My husband Gerald had passed 4 years before, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which everyone kept telling me was a mercy, as if speed made it easier to watch someone disappear. After he was gone, the house in Barrie felt enormous in a way it never had when the kids were small. Every room had too much air in it. I started leaving the radio on just to hear a voice. Gerald and I had talked about doing an Alaskan cruise for our 40th anniversary. We'd talked about it the way you talk about things you're sure you'll eventually get to, loosely, happily, without urgency. We never got to 40 years, we made it to 36, so when I turned 67, I made a decision. I was going to take that cruise, not to grieve, not to mark something sad. I was going to go because Gerald would have wanted me to, and because I had spent the better part of 4 years making myself smaller, so that other people felt more comfortable around my loss. I called my daughter, Carolyn, first. She and her husband, Derek, live in Mississauga with their 2 boys. My son Paul is in Ottawa with his wife, Renata, and their daughter, Mia, who just turned 5 and has her grandfather's eyes exactly. I told them both on the same evening, calling one after the other. I said I was thinking of doing a 10-night Alaskan cruise out of Vancouver in late July, and that I wanted to take the whole family. My treat. A proper trip together, something Gerald had wanted for us. Carolyn said, "Mum, that's so lovely." Her voice did the thing it does when she's moved, but trying not to show it. She asked about the ship, the ports, whether there was enough for kids. I told her I had the brochure right in front of me. Paul said, "You sure about the cost, Mum?" "That's a lot." I told him I was sure. I'd been careful with the money from selling the Barrie house when I downsized to my apartment in Collingwood. I had set aside enough. This was what I wanted to do with it. I want you to understand something. I didn't plan that trip to buy their attention. I planned it because I genuinely believed, I had every reason to believe, that we were the kind of family who would do something like this together. Gerald and I had always been the center of gravity. Birthdays at our house, Christmas Eve every year without exception, 2 weeks at the cottage in Muskoka, every August for 20 years straight. That's the family I thought I had. I spent 6 weeks planning. I called a travel agent in Collingwood, a woman named Sandra who had been in the business for 30 years and knew Alaska sailings the way I know my own kitchen. Together we booked a 10-night round trip out of Vancouver on a mid-sized ship, not the enormous floating moor kind, something with a bit more character. We got a cabin with a balcony for me, an inside cabin with 2 bunks for Carolyn and Derek and the boys, and a standard cabin with a pull-out for Paul, Renata and Mia. I put it all on my visa, the one with the travel points I'd been accumulating for years and never used, then paid it off immediately with the funds I transferred from my savings, just over $19,000 all told, including the flights from Toronto. I made a shared Google document. My granddaughter's friend helped me set it up over the phone with the itinerary, packing suggestions, shore excursion options, a list of what was included in the fare. I sent it to Carolyn and Paul both. Carolyn forwarded it to Derek. Paul said he'd look at it over the weekend. 3 weeks after I sent the bookings, Carolyn called on a Tuesday evening. I remember it was Tuesday because I had just come in from my walking group. We meet every Tuesday and Thursday at the trailhead on Birch Street. 5 women, all roughly my age, all of us widowed or divorced or simply living our own lives at this point. My friend Helen was the one who got me into it. She said walking was the only therapy that had ever worked for her, and after a year of doing it, I was inclined to agree. I had my coat half off when my phone rang. Carolyn's name on the screen. I thought she was calling about the shore excursion options. I'd sent her a note about the Mendenhall Glacier tour in Juneau, whether she thought the boys would manage the walk. She wasn't calling about the glacier. She said, "Mum, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I didn't know how to bring it up. But Derek and I have been talking, and we think it might actually be better if we do our own trip this summer instead." I stood in my front hallway with my coat still on one arm. "What do you mean? The boys have camp in July, and then Derek's parents want to do a cottage week, and by the time August comes, honestly, a 10-night cruise is just a lot. For everyone." I said, "I've already booked everything, Carolyn." She said she knew that. She said she was sorry. She asked whether the bookings were refundable, and something in the way she asked it, a specific practical tone, like she'd already checked, told me she had known she was going to have this conversation for a while. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside my window, the streetlights had just come on. A couple walked their dog past my building, and the dog stopped to sniff the edge of the lawn, and everything outside looked perfectly normal. "What about Paul and Renata?" I asked. She hesitated, which was its own kind of answer. "I think they might have said something similar to you. I don't know. You'd have to call Paul." I called Paul that night. His voice had the careful, measured quality it gets when he's chosen his words beforehand. He told me Renata's parents were going to be in from Poland for most of the summer, a rare visit, and that it wouldn't feel right to be away from them for nearly 2 weeks. He said they really appreciated what I had tried to do. He said tried to do, as if the trip existed only as an attempt, something that hadn't quite materialized into reality. I asked him directly, "Did you and your sister talk before you both called me?" He said, "We just mentioned it to each other, Mum. We weren't trying to coordinate against you." I don't know whether that was true. I still don't know. What I do know is that I sat at my kitchen table that night for a long time after I hung up, long enough for my tea to go cold twice. I kept turning one question over and over in my head, and I could not make it stop. When did I become someone they could just step around? I thought about Gerald, not in the heavy, grief-soaked way I used to. I've done enough of that work, but just thought about him, his face, the way he would have looked at me across this same table if he'd been here. He would have been furious. Gerald was the quietest man in any room until someone disrespected someone he loved, and then he was something else entirely. He would not have let this land quietly. But Gerald wasn't here, and I had to decide for myself what to do with it. I did not call Carolyn or Paul back that night. I did not send an email. I went to bed, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about the $19,000 I had spent, and the 6 weeks I had given to planning something I believed would matter, and the Google document with the packing lists and shore excursions that I had made with such particular hopefulness. In the morning, I called Sandra. I told her there had been a change of plans. I explained briefly what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, the way a person is quiet when they want to say something sharp, but are too professional to say it. Then she said, "So the question is what we do with what you've got." She walked me through it. The flights to Vancouver could be changed with a fee, or the points could be redeposited to my account. The cruise cabins, this was the part that mattered, were booked under my name and my credit card. I had not added anyone else as a named traveller yet, because I had been waiting for everyone to send me their passport information, which neither Carolyn nor Paul had done in the week since I'd shared the document. I had asked twice. I had not pushed. That administrative oversight, their administrative oversight, turned out to be significant. I sat with that information for 2 days. I went to my walking group on Thursday. I walked beside Helen for most of it, and at some point she noticed I was quieter than usual, and I told her what had happened. Helen is not a woman who softens things. She listened, and then she said, "What are you going to do about the cabin they were meant to take?" I had been asking myself the same thing. I thought about what I had built in that apartment in Collingwood. I thought about Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and Helen, and our friend Maureen, who laughs so loudly the birds scatter, and Janet, who brings homemade butter tarts to every walk and refuses to apologize for it, I thought about how these women had shown up for me after Gerald died in ways my own children sometimes hadn't. Not out of cruelty, but simply because grief is inconvenient and they had their own lives. And these women had already been through enough of their own to know that you don't leave someone alone in it. And I thought, why not? I didn't make a grand announcement. I didn't frame it as a statement or a lesson. I simply called Helen and asked if she'd ever been to Alaska. She said she had always wanted to go. I said, I have a cabin available in late July. Then I called Maureen. Then Janet. By Friday evening I had filled both the vacated cabins, Helen and her sister in one, Maureen and Janet sharing the other. And the trip, which had begun as one thing, quietly became something entirely different. I did not tell Carolyn or Paul I was going ahead with it. I didn't tell them I had replaced them. 3 weeks later, Paul called on a Sunday afternoon. Renata's parents had changed their travel dates, he said. They'd be coming in August instead. He asked, with a particular lightness in his voice, whether there was any chance things could be rearranged. I told him the cabins were no longer available. He asked what I meant. I said that when they'd declined, I had taken some time to think about what I wanted to do, and I had decided to go ahead with the trip with some friends instead. Silence. Then, Mom, I didn't realize you'd do that. And I said as evenly as I could manage, I didn't realize I'd have to. I heard him start to say something, and I told him I had to go, and I meant it, because Helen was coming over at 4 to look at the shore excursion options together, and I promised I'd have tea ready. Carolyn called the following week. Her tone was different from Paul's, less surprised, more careful, the way she sounds when she's trying to understand something that doesn't fit her model of how things work. She asked me if I was angry. I told her that wasn't quite the word for it. She asked what the word was. I thought about it. I said, clarified. She didn't know what to do with that, I think. We talked for a little while longer, and it was fine, and I meant everything I said, but some door had opened inside me that I hadn't known was there, and I had walked through it, and I didn't feel any need to walk back. We sailed out of Vancouver on a Thursday morning in late July. The mountains were so close to the water that it seemed impossible, like someone had arranged them specifically for the occasion. Helen stood at the railing beside me in a yellow windbreaker she'd bought for the trip, her hair coming loose in the wind, and she said, Dorothy, look at this. And I did. I stood there and I really looked at it. In Juneau, we walked to the glacier. It took longer than the brochure suggested, and Janet complained about her knees for approximately the first 20 minutes. But when we rounded the last bend in the path and the ice came into view, this enormous ancient blue-white wall of a thing, completely indifferent to all of us, she stopped talking about her knees entirely. We stood there for a long time. I thought about Gerald briefly, the easy way you think of someone you've loved a long time. Not with pain, but with a kind of private conversation. I told him about the glacier in my head. I told him it was worth the wait. In Skagway, Maureen bought a ridiculous embroidered vest and wore it for the rest of the trip without a trace of embarrassment. In Ketchikan, it rained in the particular West Coast way, straight down and steady, and we sat in a small cafe and drank chowder and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, the way you only can with people who have earned that ease with you. One evening, the 4 of us were sitting on the balcony outside my cabin, too many people for the space, technically, but nobody cared, watching the light change over the water. It was 9 o'clock and still pale outside, the way it gets that far north in summer, everything soft and stretched and unhurried. Helen said something I have thought about almost every day since. She said, I think we spent too many years waiting to be included. It never occurred to any of us that we could just go. Nobody added anything to that. It sat there in the late light, and that was enough. When I got home to Collingwood, there was a card from Carolyn in my mailbox. She had written, in her careful handwriting, that she hoped I'd had a wonderful time, and that she loved me. I stood in the lobby of my building and read it twice. I believed her. Love and thoughtlessness are not mutually exclusive. I know that now, in a way, I couldn't have told you 2 years ago. You can love someone completely and still not understand what it costs them when you treat them like a given. I put the card on my windowsill. I still have it there. I have not rebuilt things with my children exactly as they were, and I'm not sure I want to. What I built instead is something harder to describe, but easier to live inside. I take up more space now. I make plans for myself first. When Carolyn calls on Sunday evenings, I'm genuinely happy to hear her voice, because I'm no longer sitting by the phone waiting for it to prove something to me. Gerald would have liked Helen's yellow windbreaker. He would have laughed at Maureen's vest. He would have stood at that glacier railing and put his arm around me without saying a word, the way he always did when something was too big for words. I stood there anyway. And it turned out that was enough, too. I keep coming back to something Sandra, my travel agent, said without meaning to say anything profound at all. She just asked, practically, what I wanted to do with what I had, and I realized no one had asked me that in a very long time. That's the thing about being the person who organizes, who funds, who remembers everyone's dietary preferences and books the cabins with the right bed configurations. After a while, people stop asking what you want, not out of cruelty, just out of habit. You become the infrastructure of a family, and infrastructure doesn't have preferences, it just holds things up. What happened with Carolyn and Paul was painful. I won't dress it otherwise. But if I'm honest with myself, and I've had enough quiet mornings in this apartment to get there, what hurt most wasn't that they didn't come. It was how little they seemed to consider that it would hurt me. The phone calls were careful and apologetic in tone, but underneath them was an assumption that I would absorb it, rearrange myself around their decisions, and be fine by the next Sunday call. That assumption came from somewhere. It came from years of me proving it correct. There's a kind of integrity that asks you to look clearly at your own part in things. I had spent years being endlessly available, endlessly accommodating in ways that felt like love, and were love, but that also quietly taught the people around me that my needs were secondary, negotiable, movable. You cannot do that for decades and then be surprised when others have learned the lesson you were teaching. That's not blame toward myself. It's just honesty. And honesty, I'd found, is the only thing that actually moves you forward. What I'm proud of is that I didn't let the hurt make the decision for me. I could have cancelled everything, swallowed the cost, and spent that July at home with my feelings. I could have called Carolyn back and said yes, of course, whenever you're ready. Instead, I sat with it long enough to ask myself what I actually wanted, not what would keep the peace, not what would make everyone comfortable. Just what I wanted. And what I wanted was Alaska. What I wanted was to stand at that glacier with people who had chosen to show up. Choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others first is not a small thing. It takes a particular kind of clear-eyed courage that isn't loud or dramatic. It's just deciding, quietly, that you matter too. Helen said we spent too many years waiting to be included. She was right. And the moment I stopped waiting, the trip became something I couldn't have planned if I'd tried. It became real. I don't know what Carolyn and Paul took from any of this. That's not mine to control. What I know is that I came home from 10 nights in Alaska standing differently in my own life. Not harder, not colder, just more sure of where I end and where the accommodating begins. Dorothy is still here. She just stopped waiting for an invitation.